You're listening to the Bur'yan podcast, and this is the second part of the episode about Crimean Tatars. Today, we want to focus on the events of the second half of the 20th century, such as the return of Crimean Tatars to Crimea, the emergence of the Crimean Tatar national movement, as well as the recent developments of the 21st century, such as the occupation of Crimea and the repressions against Crimean Tatars in the occupied peninsula. We will also discuss the prospects for the decolonization of Crimea and possible actions by the international community that could affect the current situation of the Crimean Tatars. This episode's moderator is me, Elnara Nuriyeva-Letova. I'm Crimean Tatar cross-media activist, author, and publicist, and I'm also project manager of UA South and Jamaat projects of Crimea Media Platform. Our first guest is Martin-Oleksandr Kisly, a Ukrainian historian of Crimea and Crimean Tatars, focusing on Soviet and post-Soviet periods. In order to understand what was happening later in the 90s and in 2014, we need to know how Crimean Tatars were returning to Crimea. Martin, could you please share your expertise on that?
Crimean Tatars were keeping the memory of their homeland in their community. In exile, they formed communities of memory communities. Usually it was some big extended Crimean Tatars family. In a family circle, the stories of Crimea, the memories of Crimea were circulated. But these very issues, the next generation of in exile, they adopted this image. This image, of course, was picture perfect, sometimes too perfect. They had this notion to return to the land they have never seen. All the process of return of Crimean Tatars to their own land, it was a struggle for their rights, struggle for their own identity, struggle for their own subjectivity. And it's very difficult to talk about 90s, it's very difficult to talk about 2014 without understanding how Crimean Tatars returned to their land and what is behind the story of return. After 1944, the Crimean Tatars were put in special settlements in Uzbekistan, Ural, and other regions of Soviet Union. It was a regular village or a settlement or even a town with local population. But Crimean Tatars were under special regime and were not allowed to leave this place. So it wasn't like Gulag with some wire stripped around it with some fence. No, it wasn't. And probably it's the most sad ironic that you are living among regular people who had the possibility to leave this place, but you cannot. Many of Crimean Tatars tried to escape. By the way, some of them even tried to leave special settlements for Crimea, but they were returned back. Moreover, the Soviet authorities introduced a very special law, according to which those who are trying to escape special settlements, they received 20 years of real camps, Soviet camps, Gulag camps. This regime of special settlements, it was cancelled after the Stalin's death. And we all remember the story about Khrushchev canceling Stalin, this very short period of time in Soviet history when crimes of Stalin's period were revealed. So in 1956, many other deported people in Soviet Union by Soviet dissidents, they were called punished people. Many of them were allowed to return to their homelands. Moreover, some of them were even allowed to restore their republics, their so-called national republics. They were not national, but let's call it this way. There were three nations who were not allowed to return. The so-called Volga Germans, but not of them were from Volga region, some of them were from Ukraine and Crimea, by the way. They were deported before the Second World War started. Crimean Tatars and Meskhetian Turks. All of them were not allowed to return to their homelands. We cannot say for sure what was the actual reason, but it seems like this decision, it was made by the local authorities. Crimean Tatars were not allowed to return just because for Crimean communist elite, for Crimean authorities, the Crimea without Crimean Tatars was just perfect. They were not seen as wanted neighbors. So it seems like the Crimean communists just said to their Moscow colleagues, no, please, no Crimean Tatars here. The same with Meskhetian Turks. They traditionally were living in the part of Georgia, and it seems like the Georgian political communist elites sent the same message to Moscow. And they stayed in exile. Their rights were restored. They had the full Soviet citizens' rights. Like, they started to serve in an army, they were allowed to participate in elections, but they were still being placed in exile. But this exile was much more bigger. They were allowed to live in Moscow, they were allowed to live in Ukraine, they were allowed to live all around the Soviet Union, but not in Crimea. This very simple reason started the so-called national movement of Crimean Tatars. It can be called in different ways: dissident movement, oppositional movement, protest movement. Crimean Tatars are calling it national movement. And it's very important they're putting this national into the question. It was started by older generation of Crimean Tatars. It was followed by younger generation of Crimean Tatars. Mustafa Dzhemilev, for instance, is a younger generation. There were elders who started it, and it was followed later by those who are joining this movement. It was a grassroots movement, very horizontal, without some actual leaders. And what they were relying on, it was very deeply rooted into the Soviet everyday practices. For instance, they were gathering signs under petitions for allow Crimean Tatars to return to Crimea, and it was easily for them to collect 100,000 signs under this petition. They were sending letters to Moscow like, "We, Crimean Tatars, are still living in exile. Please return us to the homeland." They were gathering at different rallies, and usually they were using as an opportunity some events like Lenin's birthday. So to put flowers to Lenin's monument with the sign Crimean Tatars belongs to Crimea, it was very ironical and sarcastic, and it really worked. Soviet authorities were very mad because of it. In 1967, Soviet Union issued an official document according to which Crimean Tatars were rehabilitated because since 1944, according to Soviet legislation, they were called officially traitors. We are not raising this issue because this Soviet myth of collaboration, it's total bullshit. But in 1967, Crimean Tatars, as Soviet authorities declared it, they were rehabilitated, so they were able finally to return to their homeland, to Crimea. But at the very same day, another official document were issued according to which Crimean Tatars were allowed to live all around the Soviet Union, but according to the current legislation about passportization and employment of Soviet citizens. If Crimean Tatar is coming to Crimea, he was looking for a registration, propiska, but he was not allowed to receive it without being employed in Crimea. But he was not able to employ in Crimea because he didn't have a registration in propiska. So this vicious circle were created for Crimean Tatars. So according to the law, there was no discrimination and restriction of Crimean Tatars law in the Soviet Union. Some researchers, they are thinking that it was done, this move by Soviet Union, just to clear their reputation in Europe, in what we are calling today global South, because the issue of Crimean Tatar discrimination, it was started to be published outside of Soviet Union. So according to Soviet law, according to Soviet legislation, there were no issue with Crimean Tatars anymore. But on the next level, on the local level in Crimea, they were still not allowed to settle down. Nevertheless, thousands of them were coming to Crimea, and they were trying in different ways to settle down, to buy a house, to what we are calling today occupying, what we are talking about public protests. They were using central squares of Simferopol as a public place to protest against Soviet authorities and to declare their right to claim the Crimea as their homeland. In 10 years, approximately 10,000 Crimean Tatars succeeded to move to Crimea and settle down there. It's a very long story about what kind of practices they used to do it. It's an issue for another talk. But in the end of 70s, this process was stopped by Soviet authorities. They introduced another law according to which it was allowed to move Crimean Tatars from Crimea forcefully, and their houses were ruined with some bulldozers. So it stopped the process of return till the start of Perestroika. And when we are talking about the end of 80s, the start of 90s, it's probably better to talk not about the return, but about the repatriation process, because it was massive. The return was not massive. The return, it was a form of protest against Soviet authorities. At the same time, repatriation, which started with the collapse of Soviet Union, before the collapse and after the collapse, it was a very massive process when approximately 200,000 of Crimean Tatars returned to Crimea. And the story of how they were trying to find themselves in Crimea, which were still ruled by this communist elites. It was ruled by communist elites even in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Crimean Tatars were still unwanted neighbors for these elites. They were put in some ghettos in the northern part of the peninsula. They were not allowed to settle down in the southern part of the Crimean peninsula. Before the deportation, they used to live in the southern part of the peninsula. But after the deportation, Crimean Tatars, many sanatoriums, pensionats were built there for Soviet workers, of course. So the story of Crimean Tatar struggle for return in the 90s, it was a struggle for the land. We remember all these many stories of how Crimean Tatars were living in digouts, then they were living in some temporary buildings, just trying to return in all the senses of this word to the indigenous land.
Yeah, sorry, I I had kind of flashbacks. Started thinking about all that. Basically witnessing all that. Now we are going to dive deeper into the history of the Crimean Tatar national movement with our next guest, Alexandr Murtazayev, who is an independent Crimean Tatar history researcher and author. He frequently collaborates with the International Memorial Society and independent media projects centered around indigenous resistance. Hello, Alexander.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, and my pleasure to host you. So you worked a lot with archives. Could you please tell us the story or build-up chronology of Crimean Tatar national movement based on your archival findings?
Sure, yeah. First, I think it would be important to briefly outline what that archive is. It's a collection of documents connected to the Crimean Tatar national movement, starting mostly from late 60s and going until the beginning of the 90s. The documents were collected by Alexandr Murtazyev, a Soviet dissident who was one of the allies of the national movement and one of the friends. And the documents ended up in his care because they were all brought to him by members of the movement. And he compiled them and used them to write messages for foreign press or foreign human rights defenders and reports for the dissident chronicle of human rights violations in the Soviet Union called the Chronicle of Current Events. So Moscow Helsinki Group, the Moscow branch of the Human Rights Defense Initiative, was allied with the movement and aided it in getting to foreign press and getting the coverage it required. And that's how Murtazyev came in possession of that documents. And then in the 90s and then in the 2000s, he gave the archive to International Memorial. And I had the pleasure and the honor to work with it. And I'd say it demonstrates a lot of both the methods of the movement and also the mechanisms of repression used by the Soviet regime. Now to chronology. We can distinguish several stages in the development of the movement. They're mostly characterized by gradual radicalization of the demands. So if the beginning general protest was against the very fact of the deportation, the horrible living conditions in the special regime settlements that Crimean Tatars were forced to live in, and then in the next stage, it turned into the struggle of the removal of the traitor claim, of the idea that the Crimean Tatars betrayed the Soviet nation. Then it turned into the struggle for coming home. And the culmination of it, I think, is the general struggle against the Soviet rule and Soviet oppression, and the struggle for the return of the borders of the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Republic, according to the model of the 1921. As I said, the change from those stages was gradual, and it mostly happened in response to the repressions, and also was connected to the different generations of Crimean Tatars. So, to put it simply, the official beginning of the movement is considered to be 1956, when the first delegation of Crimean Tatar representatives arrived to Moscow with the first petition for the recognition of Crimean Tatars as a nation and in protest to their treatment. And already in 1970s, human rights activists characterized the movement as one of the most long-running in the Soviet Union, if not the longest running. They also note how big it was in scale. So it was truly a national movement because everybody was involved. And it was a very grassroots, horizontal, I'd say, organization with no defined core. There wasn't one particular leader. There were, of course, people who were respected and were veterans of the movement and were, well, elders, but they weren't official leaders. The 50s stage was mostly initiated by the old guard, so to say, so the older generation of Crimean Tatars who genuinely believed in communism and the revolution and, the party and all that. So lots of party functionaries, I'd say. Older intelligentsia, veterans of the war, well-known Crimean Tatar figures. And what this stage tried to accomplish is to try to persuade the Soviet government in their loyalty to it, their loyalty to the decisions of the 20th Congress of the party, their loyalty to Lenin's ideas, their loyalty to the Soviet Union and all that. Other than that, it also established a web of initiative groups that were, as I said, very decentralized. So there was, for example, a street initiative group that was uniting Crimean Tatars living in this particular area. And then there would be an initiative group of the city, and then an initiative group of the region, and so on. And they would communicate. And through these initiative groups, Crimean Tatars were able to gather an incredible amount of signatures under their petitions. So those petition letters to the Soviet government were one of the main focuses of this stage. Let me just read out the amount of signatures they got, because this is staggering. So the very first petition that was delivered by this old guard had 140,000 signatures, with more than 10,000 individual letters of appeal. And they did not stop at this. So 1958, and another appeal to the party central committee had 12,000 signatures. 1959, another appeal with 10,000 signatures. 1961, another appeal with 18,000 signatures, and a letter to the Commission of the Congress of the party with 8,000 signatures. So there's just an incredible amount of those signatures that the movement hoped would prove this large scale of Crimean Tatar loyalty to the party. So there was this belief that maybe if the party sees just that the entire nation is loyal and just wants this weird mistake to be over and for them to be treated normally again, then they would be treated justly.
This is insane that Crimean Tatars back then believed that if they show their loyalty to the Soviet motherland, they will no longer be traitors as they were accused. My grandfather truly believed that Stalin was just misinformed, and that's why he gave such an order. People back then, they had Stalin's pictures in their passports, or they had them close to their heart. And even in this movie, Haiterman, they cheered to Dear Stalin. And my granny was telling me a story of gathering when Stalin died. They all cried, they all got together. So it was actually people who were so misinformed, basically praising their murderer. And another example that I remember is a father-in-law of my uncle. He had a Lenin tattoo on his chest.
Wow.
Yes, that's the dedication.
Wow, that's dedication, yeah.
So yeah, it is just insane how actually loyal Crimean Tatar were and wanted to be in order to be treated normally, just like normal people.
Yeah, and this incredible betrayal, those Crimean Tatars who gave their life to the party, they gave their life to the cause, they genuinely believed that it would create a brave new world where people would be happy. The betrayal of those ideas and those hopes was just staggering for a lot of people. And it's exactly the reason why the next generation, which didn't have any illusions to begin with, was more radical than the first one. And I think the mistake of this stage of the movement is really well characterized by General Grygorenko, who in his first meeting with the Crimean Tatar delegation in 1968, he gave this speech that was very popular in the samizdat. And he said, "Your mistake is that you think you are talking to honest people, and those are not honest people. What was done against you, it wasn't just Stalin. It was an entire party line, and they're all still in rule. So you can't ask something of them. You can't ask of something that is yours by right. You have to demand it." And that's exactly what the newer generation started doing. As I said, they didn't have those illusions to begin with. And those people were born in the deportation, or they were deported as children. So they never knew Crimea. And Crimea was almost, not mythological, but it was a very idealized image in their heads.
Like a paradise.
Yeah, it was genuinely a paradise lost. Also, this idea wasn't born out of nowhere, because this new generation was very, very interested in the nation's history. This is another characteristic feature of the movement, that it was very much steeped in historical memory, in the preservation of this memory, in the attempts to share this memory with others. And from history to language to cultural aspects, there was a very, very strong effort to save what can still be saved and to teach each other. So, for example, there were lots of cases where students would gather and discuss history together. Or that, for example, students would learn the Crimean Tatar language together, which they were not allowed to do. It was illegal. Crimean Tatar as a language was taken out of the register of Soviet languages after 1956, as was the name Crimean Tatars. So the destruction of cultural, historical, ethnical memory and identity was crucial for the Soviet Union, obviously. So it wasn't just physical genocide, it was ethnocide, as a lot of experts call it. Obviously, it was just as important to save that, to preserve that for this movement. And so this memory was a catalyst, a foundation, I'd say, for a lot of the movement's actions. And also just for the morale, I'd say, because their resilience was being tested every single year. So the movement is very long running, which is a wonder given how many reasons they had to despair. As I said, the distinct characteristics of the movement, the massive involvement, how long-running it was, how memory fueled them. And I would add that another interesting feature was how it was very determined and it did not accept any compromises. Their goal was the return to their homeland and the restitution of everything that was taken, recovery of the autonomous Soviet Republic of Crimea as it was in the 1920s. And they were very resistant to the attempts to assimilate them among Central Asians. The Soviet government really, really tried to do that through decrees where it stated that Crimean Tatars don't need to return to Crimea because they're already doing very good in Uzbekistan and they've already assimilated. Or, they actually tried to create a region in Uzbekistan that would be Crimean Tatar region. It was in 1978 they did found Mubarak region, and it was supposed to be a national region of Crimean Tatars living in Uzbekistan. The national movement activists, they knew that. They actively stated that we see what you're trying to do, and this is not happening. A really good example for that, and also for the different attitude of the new movement, the new wave, would be a manifesto that two young Crimean Tatar activists, Enver Seferov and Shavkat Abdurrahmanov, were spreading through leaflets. They ended up on trial for that. They were given several years of labor camps. In 1961, they wrote appeals to Crimean Tatar youth And I'll just read a couple of quotes because you can see the change in attitude from asking and pleading and promising that we would be loyal to the great nation, just please let us back. And now it changes to, ladies and gentlemen communists, we have long endured and waited for mercy from you. How long can our humiliating situation last? This is tragic madness and barbarism in the middle of the 20th century. Are our people worse workers and laborers than other nations? Of course not. And you know and understand that very well. You want to forcibly silence our just cause. It is to your advantage that our nation gradually dissolves among other nations and ceases to exist as a nation, and you will fail to accomplish this. We demand for our nation to be reckoned with and to be given the opportunity to return to our homeland. Crimea is ours, and sooner or later you will recognize this. We have one goal today, homeland or death, and you will soon feel it. The responsibility for everything that has happened rests entirely on you. This is a very direct, very nonsense kind of message.
Yeah, very strong.
Very brave also. And the slogan, homeland or death, will be very popular among Crimean Tatar activists, and it will be on banners, it will be during rallies. So the beginning of the 60s sees a lot of this activity from students, from organizers, from some of the old guard, so-called old guard, who hasn't yet lost hope. Those petitions came to an end because it was obvious that they don't work, no matter how many signatures they get. In 1965, the first informational bulletin was published. It was a bulletin that documented human rights violations against Crimean Tatars. It was called simply Information, and it would be distributed through communal circles. And this meticulous documentation in this format will actually inspire the Moscow dissident branch. Also, during this period, there was established a tradition of festivities and celebrations, mass gatherings, during important dates. Once again, you can see how historical memory is just core of this all. So people would gather on the anniversaries of the formation of the Republic, would be met with festivities. People would get together for several days in the streets. They would dance, they would perform national music. And also on the mournful dates, on the anniversary of the deportation, people would fly black banners or black flags in the city. It had to be done in secret, so when they were found out, obviously they were arrested and got on trial for anti-Soviet rhetoric. So the Soviet government made every attempt to disperse them, to stop them. Police brutality obviously happened. For example, on the October 8th, 1966, it was the 45th anniversary of the formation of the Crimean Soviet Republic. The festivities were very numerous, so some of the rallies in some of the Uzbekistan cities had more than several thousand people. And police and soldiers dispersed them by force, beat up protesters, used smoke bombs, batons, fire hoses with water.
Some things never change.
Yeah, it's incredible how things stay the same. And obviously, several hundred people were arrested. Some of them were sentenced to prison terms for mass riots. And these rallies had some effect on the Soviet government. They published on September 9th, 1967, the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet Court on citizens of Tatar nationality formerly residing in Crimea. You can already, just the title is just
really?
Incredible. And, it reluctantly dismissed the charges of treason, but the dismissal of the charges was not shared in mass media. It was not communicated to the rest of the Soviet Union that the Crimean Tatars were no longer considered traitors. So this idea continued up until, I'd say, the end of the 80s, the 90s. Might still continue today. They just recycled it. In the title, you can see what they're trying to do. So instead of Crimean Tatars, it's just Tatars who previously reside in Crimea, which is, for English-speaking listeners, it would be important to clarify that Tatars and Crimean Tatars are two different nations. A lot of people don't know this. A lot of people mix this up. And this was very useful for the Soviet government because this is exactly what they needed the nation to be now. Not Crimean Tatars, but just Tatars. Like those in Kazan, for example, who have no relation to Crimea at all. And the decree also tried to state that Crimean Tatars are very well settled in Uzbekistan. They have no need to return, which, as we know, was denied by the entire nation. And then the second decree that came out close after that, it allowed Crimean Tatars to settle anywhere in the territory of the USSR, including Crimea, technically. But it stipulated that they could only do so in accordance with the current legislation on employment and passport regime. And here we come to the strategy that Crimean Tatar historians call this legislature politics Crimea without Crimean Tatars. Because the entire point of the legislature was to keep Crimean Tatars out of Crimea, and if they, by some miracle, got in, then to get them out. So before the decrees were issued, to live and work and have your children go to school in Crimea, you only needed the registration in major cities and in resorts. But right after the publication of that second decree, this passport system was immediately introduced in all settlements. So the entirety of Crimea. Every single institution refused to register Crimean Tatars. And this is actually the bulk of the archive that I worked with, was just tens and tens and tens of similar stories and similar administrative court documents demanding for the house owners to immediately leave, pronouncing the contract illegal, immediately firing them from their jobs, and so on and so forth. So the entire attempt to just move to Crimea, for that to happen, a Crimean Tatar family would have to jump an incredible amount of hoops.
And some people even change their surnames. If they sounded Crimean Tatar, they tried to Russify a little bit, so that could help. And also they were getting married with other nations and they were taking their surnames, so there is no Crimean Tatar.
The surname would help definitely,
Yes.
because even in those mixed marriages, if the Crimean Tatar party was still like visibly Crimean Tatar, had a Crimean Tatar surname, it was known to the officials that they're Crimean Tatar, still they would not be registered. And for example, the house is immediately sold to, say, Russian or Ukrainian spouse. But then, as soon as they learn that the partner of this person is Crimean Tatar, the contract is revoked. It's immediately
Really?
broken. Yeah, lots of cases. Like,
So I heard just one part of the story, that people were trying to do something, but it was still
There
not
may-
very helpful.
there might have been successful cases, obviously, but I know of a lot of unsuccessful ones, unfortunately. Once again, I'll just read a couple of quotes from one of those documents. It's incredible how similar all those stories are. The more you see just dozens and dozens of people going through this exact same route and receiving this exact same treatment, you can realize the scale of it. This one person, Crimean Tatar, he was sent to work as a physical education teacher in a school, and he was appointed to the position in the beginning of October 73. And then when he came to the village council in order to get residence, the registration, he was denied of it on the ground of being Crimean Tatar. And after that, the principal of the school and the deputy of the public education department summoned him into their office, where he was suggested to sign a resignation letter at his own will. And the principal of the school told him that you Tatars are not allowed to reside and work in Crimea. Similar case, the prosecutor brought an action in court to declare the sale and purchase of the house invalid, motivating the claims by the fact that in August of 1973, Osmanov and Shotkina bought a house under a domestic transaction from Yemelyanova, and the contract was not notarized and is therefore invalid. The defendants did not validate the claim and explained that they had not drawn up the contract because they had no residence registration, so they could not confirm it at the notary office. So you can see it's a chicken and egg kind of thing. You can't move further without this particular document. At some point, the evictions from the houses where people lived were also incredibly violent. So it wasn't just like, oh, well, your house has been sold illegally, you have like a 10-day notice, please gather your things and leave. No. It was like a mini replayment of the deportation. The police would come at night, they would gather everybody, throw out their things, sometimes destroy their things, they would beat people up, they would throw toddlers into the ground, they would throw old people, veterans of the war, so they literally treated people like dirt. And for a lot of people, Crimean Tatars, that was obviously a reenactment of the deportation. It was very re-traumatizing. What's also interesting is that Crimean officials often employed Slavic settlers. They used their aggression, so it wasn't just the police that would come and beat you up. Russian-speaking settlers of Crimea would also do that. And they were not just allowed, they were encouraged. Interestingly, this continued in Crimea even in the 90s. This is not an isolated case specific to Soviet Union. Using the aggression of settlers against the indigenous population is just such a widespread tactic. This is what's happening in Israel right now. This is what has been done in Algiers, just as old as settler colonialism is. So according to human rights activists, from 1967 and until 1979, about 15,000 people were able to register in Crimea, and that's less than 2% of the entire population. And even then, I feel like that's a lot, given what they had to go through.
Thus, we can see how difficult it was for Crimean Tatars to return to our homeland after the deportation, and we can see the conditions the Soviet authorities created to prevent our return. It is all the more heartbreaking to see what is happening in Crimea now, but we need to know the history of the return of the Crimean Tatars to understand how and why Russia is still terrorizing us on our own land and our own homes. A Crimean Tatar activist, a member of the Crimean Solidarity human rights organization who chose to participate in this episode anonymously for their safety, told us about the developments in Crimea after its annexation by Russia in 2014 until today. We started our conversation with the most significant case, the so-called Hizb ut-Tahrir case, that instrumentalized religion as a repression tool against Crimean Tatars and led to massive accusations of terrorism. So I asked our guest to explain what Hizb ut-Tahrir was and how it was related to the Muslims of Crimea. The answer was as follows. Hizb ut-Tahrir, or Liberation Party, is an international Islamic political party. There was a decision of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation on February 14, 2003 to ban the party's activities and include it in the list of terrorist parties, even though there was not a single evidence of organizing a terrorist act by the party for 75 years of its existence. Back in 2006, Russia adopted the law on countering terrorism and established the concept of terrorist organizations in it. Neither actual nor alleged members of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Crimea fall under this definition. In 2014, the Muslims of Crimea, through the fault of the Russian authorities, found themselves in a legal trap due to the ban of the party, which was in effect on the territory of the Russian Federation. In Ukraine, the party's activities are not banned. The organization's activities are engaged in publishing a newspaper, can speak openly in the media, and hold mass public events. The first arrests under this category of criminal cases in Crimea began in 2015, when the peninsula came under Russian control. Simply because Russia came to Crimea with its legislation, it brought a huge power apparatus, and this apparatus needed food. The human rights activists believe that members of this organization are persecuted because of the public actions of some party supporters against political repression in Crimea, systemic criticism of the Russian authorities, and mass disloyalty towards Russia among Crimean Tatars in response to the events of 2014. Over the years, there have been 18 waves of detentions of Crimean Tatars involved in Hizb ut-Tahrir cases. In one small town of Bakhchisarai, there are now 6 groups of such detainees. The Russian police are prosecuting 117 people in the Hizb ut-Tahrir cases, and 114 of them are Crimean Tatars. The persecuted people were simply using their rights that are guaranteed by a democratic state, namely, gathering peacefully, visiting mosques and discussing any religious and social topics there, studying religion, disseminating their views, religious and political convictions, studying Islamic literature, taking an active part in the public life of the people, and so on. So it was precisely for these actions that the FSB carried out prosecution. My next question was about Crimean Solidarity, the Crimean human rights organization which our guest is a member of, how it was created and what are the main areas of its activity. The answer was as follows. In general, in Crimea, all these years there has been a constant systemic protest in connection with arrests and searches. People have not accepted the new reality. And this is the most important, the most valuable thing, that there has been no normalization of repression. Crimean Tatars constantly, publicly appealed to the Russian law enforcers on the peninsula, trying to talk to the police right at the place of searches, saying that they are chasing the wrong people and looking for terrorists in the wrong places. It is largely for these reasons the informal human rights movement Crimean Solidarity appeared in 2016. The platform united relatives of the arrested, lawyers and activists to protect people on the peninsula from political repression, torture and abductions. Collective initiatives are always more effective than individual ones. The social movement includes all those who are in solidarity with those prosecuted in politically motivated cases and who wish to seek justice exclusively through non-violent methods. The very first meeting was attended by only 15 people. Now there are dozens of activists in different districts of Crimea, plus very clearly defined areas of work. Crimean Solidarity is open to absolutely different people persecuted for dissent, regardless of confession or nationality. But the biggest block remains the cases related to Crimean Tatars. The legal wing has a team of human rights lawyers working daily. Our guest says they imagine these lawyers with a Batman cape on because working in such mode is very stressful. Searches at 4 a.m., chronic court hearings, constant consultations, in person and on the phone. Media work is done by citizen journalists. Many of them have no special education, but they are ready to shed light on the situation in Crimea at the cost of their own freedom. There are colleagues among them who have grown into professional journalists, and it is somehow particularly warm to watch this process. Such an improvised journalism faculty in real time, right in the field. A group of volunteers provide social and medical assistance to the families of political prisoners, and the coordinators of the projects Bizim Balalar, which means our children, and Crimean Childhood are engaged in the development and adaptation of young children left without fathers. Now there are 244 such children. People help in different ways, various educational and cultural events, collection of books, stationery, clothes and toys, organization of recreation of children and their psychological rehabilitation. A lot of activists of Crimean Solidarity experience searches, interrogations and detentions. Lawyers Lilia Gimidji, Rustem Kamilov, Nazim Shekhmambetov and Alexei Ladin were deprived of their licenses. Lawyers Aider Azamatov, Edem Simedlyaev, Eminia Avamilova, Emil Kurbidinov, Rustem Kamilov, and Nazim Shekhmambetov survived administrative arrests. According to the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and human rights organizations, there are 218 political prisoners in Crimea now. 159 people have been already removed from the peninsula. The largest array remains the case of Hizb ut-Tahrir, 117 people from the total list, which is more than half. Some cases are related to the persecution of the Jehovah's Witnesses, so there is pressure on people in Crimea on national, religious, and political grounds. These are civilians, non-combatants, who are subjected to administrative and criminal persecution and held in detention centers and prisons on trumped-up charges. If you look at those who are arrested in Crimea, 80% of them are people with higher education, doctors, economists, lawyers, political scientists. They were not hiding anywhere. After 2014, they simply decided to stay in Crimea. This list includes 20 journalists, human rights activists, and religious figures. The main problem that absolutely all political prisoners face is that they are systematically denied medical care, in particular people with disabilities, the elderly, those who have chronic diseases, or who have been tortured and acquired serious diseases due to inadequate conditions in Russian prisons. While in the early years we talked about a few specific cases, now, years later, the number of such political prisoners has increased significantly. Today, there are already 67 people. Last year, 2 Crimean political prisoners, Crimean Tatar Jamil Gafarov and Ukrainian Konstantin Shirin, died in Russian prison after they were not given medical care. I asked our guests what helps them to continue the struggle, and their answer was quite touching. I'm gonna quote it. A sense of responsibility for people, for their lives. We believe in our activism and work, that it helps, protects, saves. We believe that our solidarity is stronger than the law enforcers who silently follow orders from above, stronger than judges who silently sign criminal rulings on the arrest of innocent people, stronger than all this tangle of various structures by whose hands repression against people in Crimea is carried out. Solidarity in Crimea is not an organization on paper that can be banned. It is not a group of people that can be liquidated through showy and high-profile arrests. Today, it is a zone of trust, a place where all bridges are bridged, where people's internal dialogues are held, where perspectives are discussed, and where people unite, regardless of religious or political views, with one goal, a common struggle against injustice. One should not give up, even if it seems that nothing around heralds change. All battles are lost when people stop believing. The tremendous support from people in Crimea and from people who live outside of Crimea also helps a lot. This is the biggest source of inspiration and energy. My last question was, what can be done to help Crimean political prisoners? And I found our guest's response quite surprising. I'm gonna quote it too. Write letters to them. This is a support for the prisoners themselves and at the same time a signal to the system that these people are remembered. We always try to warm our people in prison, at least with words. Tell their stories, become their voices. Each of us is now, to some extent, involved in this common struggle for the right to live in our own land. Someone quietly reads prayers in their house every evening for all the unjustly arrested and oppressed. Someone collects packages for them, traveling hundreds of kilometers. Someone warms the fatherless children in their houses. Someone gives a part of every salary or pension to the families of the arrested. Someone fights for the freedom in court every day, defending their interests. Someone tells the world about all these trials. Someone stands under the courts all year round. Without each of these links, the struggle would be many times more difficult. I would like to once again call on representatives of human rights organizations, state structures, and international institutions to fight more actively for the release of all political prisoners in Crimea. Russia must stop the illegal persecution in Crimea. So now we are going back to the 60s and the events of the struggle of the Crimean Tatar national movement.
Also, throughout this time period, there are multiple continuous delegations of Crimean Tatar representatives to Moscow. They just endlessly, tirelessly continued to travel there. Starting from 1964, there was a permanent representation delegation of Crimean Tatars in Moscow. Another really interesting thing that happened in this period, it actually began in 1957 and then continued actively throughout the 60s, is that the deportation was first conceptualized as a genocide. Not just a mistake of Stalin or some other official, no. Now it was regarded as a deliberate politics and as a deliberate continuation of Russian imperial politics. So the connection between Russian imperial settler colonialism and Soviet settler colonialism was drawn, and it was very obvious for everybody. And what allowed people to see deportation as a genocide was very carefully gathered and analyzed data during a self-population census. There were several self-censuses compiled by Crimean Tatar activists. The first one was in 1957, as you can see, very early. The second in 1966, and then the third one lasted from 1970 to 73. Information was gathered and analyzed by the initiative group in Fergana, and the materials of those self-censuses were then used as a basis for understanding the deportation and understanding the scale of death. We can also see student organizations, youth organizations springing during the 60s. They don't last long, usually, because their members are arrested very fast. But for a lot of students and a lot of young people, those organizations are like the training ground. This is where they learn how to organize, what to do and how to do it best. So, late 1960s. The phase of cooperation with other movements, usually it's considered that it started in March 1968, because this is when General Grygorenko first came face-to-face with Crimean Tatar activists. General Grygorenko is also an icon of Ukrainian dissident activity. He used to be a war general. He fought in the Second World War, and he genuinely believed in communist ideas until he stopped doing that. And upon learning about Crimean Tatar struggle, Grygorenko was very impressed by the resilience and the activity, and also just horrified by the reality of their struggle. He gave the speech that I mentioned, the one about not dealing with honest people. And from that evening until the end of his life, he was a very close ally and friend of the movement. Another interesting point that he gives in this speech, he says, establish contacts with all progressive people of other nations. Seek help from the world community and international organizations. And the activists took him up on this word. Even in the archive that I was going through, you can once again see so many open letters and petitions and addresses to international organizations, to the Muslim organizations, to human rights organizations, to the press, to presidents of other countries. So yeah, it wasn't just focused in Crimea or in Uzbekistan, it was very international. And from this meeting with Grygorenko, this is considered the moment when the national movement started being supported by the broader dissident movement, and they got more resources. They got more opportunities to get the information about the struggle to foreign press. So just some examples of this cooperation. In February 1968, in the collective document of the Moscow Human Rights Defenders, one of the first documents addressed to the West, among the most intolerable violations of civil rights in the USSR was the prohibition of Crimean Tatars to return to their homeland. Then, also in 1968, the second issue of the Chronicle of Current Events published the appeal of the Crimean Tatar people to the world community. In 1974, on 30 years anniversary of the deportation, came out the issue of the Chronicle of Current Events that was fully devoted to Crimean Tatars. The entire issue was about the struggle of Crimean Tatars, the post-deportation history, the activities of initiative groups, the reports of offenses, and it was prepared by the same Alexander Lavut and Lyudmila Alexeyeva, another prominent Soviet dissident. And they note that the movement is unique for USSR in its mass and its duration. Another very good example, which is also an important moment in movement history, was the rallies in Chirchik in 1968.
In Uzbekistan.
Yes. So, as I said, the traditional festivities that happened on the eve of, in this case, on the eve of Lenin's birthday. As we can expect, the Chirchik festivities were dispersed very, very harshly. Once again, with batons, fire hoses, smoke bombs. More than 300 people were arrested and later sentenced to 15 days of imprisonment for petty hooliganism. And then during the night and the following days, there was a series of searches and raids and arrests. And the evening of that same day, activist Ayder Bariev also participated in the Chirchik events. He arrived in Moscow with photographs of the dispersal and of the police violence. And the very next day, Grygorenko organized a press conference with foreign journalists where the events of the Chirchik festivities were given to the foreign press and were internationally known. Grygorenko himself considers that after this, the international community learned about the Crimean Tatar struggle. So, starting from 68, there was a lot of collaboration and cooperation, and the New Year's 1969 issue of the Information Bulletin describes it like this. The national movement of the Crimean Tatar people has entered a new phase. Now we are not alone. Also an interesting thing, that there was also a large diaspora abroad. Crimean Tatar diaspora, for example, in the United States. So just another example, 1973, in April, there were rallies and demonstrations of Crimean Tatars and Soviet immigrants of other nationalities in New York, in front of the United Nations building. The next stage is considered the stage of decline, which seems weird, right? We just had some good news. We just got allies. What's wrong? I'd say that this term is a little misleading because it makes people think that all activity ceased or declined, while in reality, what ceased was the attempts to communicate with the authorities. Because by the middle part of the 1970s, a lot of Crimean Tatar activists were imprisoned and they were not getting out anytime soon. And the rest decided that what they've been doing doesn't yield any results and they should instead focus on trying to return to Crimea. As we know, the main problem with that was the registration system, but they were still trying to do it again and again. And in 1978, the USSR Council of Ministers actually introduced another decree to tighten up this registration system even further. So it's called On Additional Measures to Strengthen the Passport Regime in the Crimean region. It worsened the penalties for the violation of the passport rules. It legalized administrative evictions from houses without a trial, what I've been talking about. And it also introduced sanctions for selling houses to Crimean Tatars. The Chronicle of Current Events comments on this, that the resolution actually introduces a state of emergency in Crimea, cancelling the effect of some laws. A measure of forced removal from the region, which is also very popular. You weren't just removed from your house. You were basically deported from Crimea. And sometimes you would either get several years of labor camps for breaking the passport rules, or if you're lucky, you would just get banned from entering Crimea for several years. And quite a lot of people did it again and again and again, just never giving up. So a very common case, a person goes to Crimea, tries to register, the usual happens, they get 3 years of labor camps, 3 years pass, and they return to Crimea to try it again.
Or they also try to settle close to Crimea.
Yes, that's
For example, in Ukrainian cities like Genichisk or Novoalexeyevka, or on the Russian side in Krasnodar, or in Krymsk. There is even a city that is called Krymsk, from Uzbekistan, closer to Crimea at least somewhat.
I guess for a lot of people, it really gave them strength to just at least be near their homeland. Because I've heard stories of people, like if you went to Crimea, you would bring a sack of Crimean soil in a little bag for the others, and they would touch it reverently, and this was all they had. I've heard similar stories of other indigenous peoples who are no longer allowed to live on their land. So just to give you an idea of what this new decree did, if in 10 months, from January to October 1978, 20 Crimean Tatar families were evicted, then in just 4 months, from November 78 to February 79, 60 families were evicted. So they cranked it all up. 1978 also is a very dark date because in June 1978, a Crimean Tatar, one of those who were trying again and again to enter Crimea and live there, Musa Mamut, committed suicide by self-immolation. He drenched himself in gasoline and used matches, and he died in 3 days in a hospital from the shock and the burns. And as his wife says, he was in full conscience. He talked to her before dying, and he said that he doesn't regret what he did. If he didn't do it, their nation would continue to suffer. He hoped that this would do something.
And it did.
It did, although the suffering unfortunately continued. And then the Perestroika comes, and people can see and can finally hope for some change. And during the Perestroika, this new phase of activity and new phase of radicalization turns into what Soviet press called self-seizures and what the Crimean Tatar activists called self-returns, because people have by this time realized that it's pointless to ask, to demand, to communicate with the authorities. And the only way to come home that they had left was to just come there and just refuse to leave, basically. So they would just come and establish at first a tent city, which would later develop into a full-blown settlement, which they would build themselves. They would acquire the building instruments and resources themselves, and they would build those little cities that often clashed with Slavic settlers. The authorities actively used settlers' fears and anxieties and aggression towards Crimean Tatars, because as usual, settlers are very scared that they would be treated the same way that they treated the indigenous population. December 14, 1989, in the village of Dzidzimierkoy, hundreds of soldiers, policemen, and drunkards from neighboring villages were sent to attack the residents of the tent city. In other villages, the situation was similar, but the only way they would be just left alone was after long demonstrations, rallies, and only then they were allocated plots of land to build there. And by May 1990, there were 83,000 Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And out of those, 82,000 were registered. Now that you know that the registration had to be won through literal blood, tears, and sweat, you can realize that this number is very, very significant. In April 1987, the first all-union meeting of initiative groups of the movement happened. So all those initiative groups that have been established since the 1950s, they came together to discuss their strategy. The meeting was held in Tashkent, and the participants drafted the text of the appeal of the Crimean Tatar people to Mikhail Gorbachev, with the demands of their people and a list of their representatives. And they also sent a delegation to Moscow to seek Gorbachev's reception. The delegation arrived to Moscow in July 1987. From the very beginning of their stay, every day they would go to editorial offices of mass media, to central television, and they sent letters and appeals and asked the media to publish those letters. And the editors always said that they couldn't do it without the instructions from above. Throughout July, Crimean Tatar groups gathered in the Red Square, and there were demonstrations in the Red Square, sit-ins. They would be demanding for Gorbachev to come out and screaming, "Homeland, homeland." Then they would talk to some officials who gave completely pathetic answers. You know, just wait and see, just wait and see. And people would continue to rally and refused to leave. On July 27, there was another mass demonstration with almost 1,000 people in Izmailovsky Park in Moscow, and as usual, it was brutally dispersed. May 1989, on the 5th all-union meeting, we see the establishment of the organization of the Crimean Tatar National Movement, which practically became a political party. It wasn't just an initiative group, no. Its main goal was to make the movement more organized and effective in its struggle. They established policies, they established foundational documents, and Dzhemilev was elected chairman, because who else, of course. It was quite successful because finally we're getting to the good news part. In 1989, after 44 years, the USSR Supreme Soviet Court adopted the Declaration on the Recognition of Illegal and Criminal Repressive Acts against peoples subjected to forced resettlement. This was the final acknowledgement that everything that has been done to Crimean Tatars was in fact criminal, and that they are free to return to Crimea if they want, which they did. This is considered the main win, the main good piece of news, which then follows by a not-so-good piece of news, because in 1991, there was a referendum on the transformation of the Crimean region into the Crimean ASSR, so the Autonomous Soviet Republic, and Crimean Tatars insisted on being given national autonomy, the dream since so very long. And instead, the autonomy was territorial, not national. So their appeals were not recognized. They boycotted the referendum, considering it just another re-establishment of a Russian-speaking colony on their land. And despite the protests, the results of the referendum remained in force. And we can kind of see how they were right? I'd say that long-term, in perspective, it's exactly the Russian-speaking, Russian-sympathizing population of Crimea that led us to the current occupation. Because basically, Crimean Tatars once again became a minority on their land. So in June 1991, we see the All-Party Congress. Kurotai means basically that, a congress of the people. It was held in Simferopol from June 26 to June 30. Obviously, the Crimean authorities didn't want this to happen. They only signed the authorization to hold it after several hundred Crimean Tatars protested. The Kurotai basically adopted the main foundational documents of the movement: the Declaration of the National Sovereignty, the appeal to all residents of Crimea, the appeal to the Crimean Tatar people, and it also elected the Mejlis, which is the executive body of the Kurotai. Mustafa Dzhemilev was appointed chairman.
Because who else?
Yeah, who else? It was the second Kurotai, not the first one, because the very first Kurotai was held in 1917, and it was dissolved in 1918 by the Crimean Regional Military Revolutionary Committee. They all have such long names, just several words, one after the other. And by calling this Kurotai the second, the organizers emphasized the continuity between the events. It was a way to, first of all, honor the very first Kurotai, and also a way to emphasize that the second Kurotai was doing what the first one didn't have the chance to do.
Now we're going to talk about the perspectives of decolonization of Crimea with our next guest, Elmaz Alimova, who is Crimean Tatar researcher, Chevening scholar, Master of Science student of Human Rights and Politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Now moving on to the topic that you're actually working on, it is decolonization of Crimea. And currently, there are not only talks, but there are actually some movements in regard to establishing the status of the representative body of the Crimean Tatars at the legislative level. The representative organ is called Mejlis, and currently Crimean Tatars are trying to establish it in Ukraine. Actually, there was also a law in 2021 that we didn't talk about indigenous peoples of Ukraine, and this is like the next step of this law, that now Mejlis, the representative body of Crimean Tatars, need to be officially recognized in Ukraine. So, what can you share here? We assume that Ukraine can be a good showcase country when it comes to such things.
Talking about decolonization, I would like to make a point that probably decolonization should start from decolonizing our minds and so-called mental decolonization, and asking ourselves the question, what do we know about true Crimea, not about those narratives, Soviet and pro-Russian, which we are kind of also inheriting, right? But what do we know about true Crimea? What do we know about its indigenous people? Who are they? What is at the core?
A very vivid example of that is that when we see a swallow's nest, which is a decorative castle, as a symbol of Crimea, which is rather a symbol of imperial era of Russia. And we actually forget about the real symbolic sites of Crimea, such as Crimean Khan Palace in Bakhchisarai, or Chufut Kaleh in Bakhchisarai, or the Mosque of Khan Uzbek in Stary Krim, Iskiqaram, or when we forget about Karim Kenasi in Kislev, which is Eupatoria.
Secondly, about, as you said, whether Ukraine can be a showcase for safeguarding the rights of its indigenous people. It can be both. It can be a successful story if it truly follows and adopts all the international norms which help to safeguard the right of Crimean Tatars on their own land. You said that Ukraine adopted the UN resolution on indigenous people. It's important document, but we should also not forget that the only legally binding document, which is Convention of International Labour Organization, Convention 169, it's the only legally binding document which helps to provide for the rights of indigenous people, and it hasn't been ratified yet by Ukraine. And if I'm not mistaken, in 2004, by Venice Commission, it was like a suggestion that Ukraine ratifies this. It's important because it gives another approach towards safeguarding indigenous rights of Crimean Tatars on a higher international levels. When talking about decolonization processes, it's also important to mention that Ukraine doesn't end up in this so-called organized hypocrisy. You know, when something is stated on a political level, it's adopted, be it resolutions or declarations or whatever, where it exists on a paper, but when it's not being done in reality. So not to end up in this organized hypocrisy, Ukraine should be very consistent towards its policy to Crimean Tatars as indigenous population, and it could not be done without giving proper rights and without returning the agency to Crimean Tatars and closely engaging and collaborating with the Mejlis, as you mentioned, the only executive representative body of Crimean Tatar population. Unfortunately, the law is not signed yet. The law on Mejlis, which engages Mejlis into Ukrainian political legislative field, it's not signed yet. We might ask questions why, but the fact is the fact that it's not there yet. So Ukraine still has lots to do. Of course, there are lots of more urgent issues maybe, but the issue of Crimean Tatars is also not a second-rated one. It's also one of the priorities, right? And lots of things could have been done, but haven't been done. It's another question again. The thing is that the approaches now should be rethought. We don't have another 20, 30 years to wait for processes to move further. It's a challenging way. I believe it's manageable and it's possible with the support of international allies. So the processes of deoccupation and decolonization move faster rather than slower.
I would also like to highlight the importance of indigenous toponyms, because when Russia deported Crimean Tatars, I mean, actually, it started way earlier, but the renaming of all the villages and towns, it reached its peak when Crimean Tatars were deported. And now, instead of the original names, there are gazillions of Krasnoarmeyskoye, Shtormovoye, Uglovoye, and so on. So what do you think in that regard?
For me, it's not even a question whether toponyms and the native names of towns, villages should be returned to Crimea, of course, and it should be done already now, because that's the logic of settler colonial states. When they come and they erase your identity, right? Actually, one of the scholars of settler colonialism theories say that settler colonialism is a consistent practice when you are demolishing, when you are destroying firstly, and then you are building a new state. So that's basically what's happening. Destroying, getting rid of everything which is native, everything which is reminiscent of national, of indigenous, Crimean Tatar, and especially giving these names, as you mentioned, of Soviet, some type names like Lenin, Sholkin, and so on, of the regime which actually exterminated, deported the whole indigenous people. So for me, it's not even a question. Returning toponyms, it's showing the true face of Crimea, showing stolen identity, getting it back to its people, and showing what a level of crime was committed to the whole population systematically during centuries. Without restoring the true Crimean Tatar identity and giving back what was stolen for centuries, we cannot talk at all about any decolonization processes. And Ukraine as a state might get a huge step forward in this regard, but also backwards, right? If Ukraine follows the colonial policy that is now happening in Crimea, exercised by Russians, So we should completely reconfigure and rethink how we approach the question of Crimean indigenous people. What do we do to return people their agency, where they are able to decide their own future within Ukrainian political context, of course. Getting back to Crimean Tatars, their right for self-determination, for their own agency to decide the fate of their land. That's the true dismantlement of the colonial narratives. It's a huge task, and it's only manageable if we understand for ourselves what is Crimea and Crimean Tatars for us in bigger context.
Could you please elaborate on the instruments themselves? Like you mentioned Convention 169. What are other legal instruments? What are other things that can be done on international level? For example, just recently, Poland recognized deportation of Crimean Tatars as genocide. And now Crimean Tatar activists in Germany, we are actually working on that. We are going to get the signatures, and officially the petition is already approved by Bundestag in Germany. So this is something that we want to do here. And my question is, what are other instruments to help Ukraine to bring Crimea back, and not only just bring it back, but also start decolonizational process? Because while Crimea is occupied, we can only speak about those things, and it's very important that we talk about them. But at the same time, what would be other steps that can be taken?
The work to be done by Ukraine on a wider international level is enormous. Adopting International Labour Organization Convention 169, which is the only so far legally binding treaty aimed at protecting the rights and cultures of indigenous people, is one of the ways for this. Ukraine could utilize the main legal instruments and strategies, such as international courts and tribunals. For instance, International Court for Justice, where Ukraine already has cases against Russia, as far as I know, accusing it of violating treaties, including International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination or International Convention for the Suppression of Financing of Terrorism. Ukraine also filed cases to the European Court of Human Rights, claiming of those atrocities that Russia commits in Crimea, including the treatment of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians under Russian occupation. Also, one of the ways of the legal approaches is closer collaboration with International Criminal Court, the ICC, as we know, which investigates war crimes and crimes against humanity, which is of high focus now, especially during an unprovoked Russian-led war against Ukraine. Also, I would say continuation of a quite good work that Ukraine does on UN General Assembly level, garnering support for resolutions condemning Russia's actions in Crimea and continuing to push for more proactive approaches through these documents to delegitimize Russian control. I would also say working more actively and more efficiently on the track of international sanctions, uniting our partners and international stakeholders on this track, and to recognize the genocide against Crimean Tatar people is of an utmost importance. I completely agree with that, as it's very symbolic and strong in terms of showing that the crimes, such as genocides, they do not have any statute of limitations, and that perpetrators, sooner or later, will be held accountable. And this is what we should be aiming towards in terms of justice and in terms of showing who is now the successor of what was committed in the past. Also, we should probably seek the cases of other countries, successful cases which resolved the issues of indigenous populations on its territories. One of such examples that come to my mind might be the Sami people of Northern Europe, who are dispersed across Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden and Finland, Unlike many other indigenous or tribal populations, Sami people lack a well-defined exclusive territory, and they coexist with larger populations. Indigenous Sami communities, in particularly Norway or Sweden, have established the Sami parliaments to represent fairly their collective voice within state structures. So such approach to self-determination, like in Norway, involves integrating the perspectives of indigenous Sami people into state policies rather than seeking, for instance, territorial autonomy. It's also called a breaking in strategy, which allows to Sami people efficiently influence laws of their country that affect Sami rights, including land management or cultural preservation. So, some of such cases can be analyzed, such models can be adopted if applicable, and some connections could be on a bilateral basis be established with such countries to take the best models and try to integrate them and see how they might work in Ukraine in our Crimean Tatar context.
You were listening to the Bur'yan podcast. Our guests today were Martin-Oleksandr Kisly, Alexandr Murtazayev, Elmaz Alimova, and a Crimean Tatar human rights activist who asked to stay anonymous. Moderating this issue was me, Elnara Nurieva-Letova. If you are interested in learning more about Crimean Tatar history and culture, listen to episode 2 of this podcast. If you want to reach us and share your thoughts on this episode, please email us at bidamedia@proton.me.